Program Director for our training section today. So thank you so much for joining us. Allow me to welcome you all to this third training session of our 4-part online training series. And we welcome many of you who are back again, who have been with us from when we started with the previous sessions, and also greet the new people who are joining us today. And thank you so much for being with us. May I request that perhaps before we start this morning, we introduce ourselves just by saying your name and which organization you are from. You can please keep your sound unmuted as you speak, or Natalie will help us, and you can keep your camera on so that we can see who you are as you introduce yourself. So I'm not sure how to go about this because the people I see on my screen, I can't say the one on the right, it might not be the right one on your screen. So I'd rather call names as I see them on the screen because there's not many of us. And I'll start with Adele, just to introduce herself and which organization she's representing. Then we'll take it from there. If I just call your name, you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Thank you very much. Adele, I think there's something wrong with sound. We can't hear you. I see you are unmuted, but for some reason we can't hear you. Let's try again. Okay. I guess as you try to fix that, let me go to the next person because I think there's some technical glitches on your side there. Who is Gracious? I just see a name, Gracious. I don't see the face. There she goes. All right, Gracious, hi. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Gracious, and I am with Campus Crusade for Christ.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Gracious. And Bongi, greetings.
Good morning, friends. My name is Bongi, and I'm with the Methodist Church of Southern Africa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Adele, are you back? Is your sound okay now? Okay. Nope. Still can't hear you.
There you are. Try now.
Yeah. I see you are unmuted from our side. I'm not sure what's going on, but let's keep trying. I think the best thing you can type your name, your surname, and organization. I'll just introduce you to everyone while you're still fixing your sound there. I see, well, it's labeled Channel 7. Gentlemen, we lost them. Okay, we lost you there.
I'm not sure. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You back? Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. I'm Neil van den Berg from Channel 7 in Africa, in Windhoek, in Namibia. As far north as we can get maybe at this stage. And I have with me Mary Ann Tyson. She's running our financial department. And we're looking forward to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot and welcome. Dave, I don't think you need much introduction, but because we're doing that, maybe who knows? Maybe someone doesn't know who you are.
Thanks, super. Director Radio Consulting, and also ACM board member.
I'll turn it down.
So, thanks, Dave. Okay, Adele, you back? We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry, hi.
There we go.
Hi, I'm Adele Bossel from Impact Radio. Sorry about that. I was clicked on the wrong audio settings, but thank you. And I'm very excited about this session. Thank you to the ACM for hosting it. We are really enjoying the training sessions that are coming through. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Adele. Natalie, I also doubt you need any introduction, but let's do it because we're introducing ourselves.
I'm Natalie from the Association of Christian Media.
Great. Thank you. I see that there are other people who are joining us. Welcome. If you've just joined us, you came in as we were still busy introducing ourselves. We're expecting around, how many people, Natalie? We're expecting?
12 or 13 people.
12 or 13. So we can still do the introductions of those who've just joined us. I see there's Neo Potwana. Neo, greetings. Can you introduce yourself? If you are able to also start your video, that will be great. If you can't, it's okay. If we could just hear you. Okay. Neo can't hear us, I guess, so he's still. Neo, are you there? All right. And I see there's also Mama. I'm not sure if it's the name, but yeah.
It's a name.
Okay.
Hello, Neo Potwana is so far Michelle and Sean.
Oh,
that's our name. We can hear you. We've got you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Michelle and Sean, for joining us. Welcome. Mama, over to you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Mama Sibofi. I'm also part of Soreta. So it's such a pleasure to join you this morning. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Thanks and welcome. Nolwandle, you there? Nolwandle, you there? Okay. I guess she's trying to join in. Anyway, let's move on. Those who will be joining us, we will see how best we welcome them, but I guess they will find us having started. May I just request that we keep our mics off now so that we don't have any interruptions, and we'll only allow the speaker, and when we are at the Q&A session, for you to unmute your mics. You are more than welcome, because I don't think there's many of us for the sake of bandwidth. You are more than welcome to keep your camera on or off if you so wish. Greg, I didn't ask him to introduce himself. I'll do that for him, but maybe when he starts giving us the training, he will further introduce himself. He will be speaking to us for about 45 minutes. Then we will go straight to Q&A. And at that time, we'll be posing all the questions we have to him, and he will be answering your questions. You are more than welcome to also type your questions in the chat box, or what we call the comment box. And as we move along, I will pose those questions to him. I'll read them on your behalf, but you can also ask those questions live. Today, Greg will be speaking on long-term financial strategies, how to build a solid foundation. Don't we all need to know that? Long-term financial strategies and how to build solid foundation. And we're looking forward to hear what Greg is to share with us this morning. First, let me introduce him, then I will give or hand over to him to start with the training. Greg is born and bred East Londoner. He's born in East London. He's a qualified chartered accountant who started his career in a family business named after his father, called Graham Clur and Associates. In 2003, Greg answered to the call of God to come to Christian ministry, and he joined the River Group in East London, South Africa, incorporating River Ministries and Faith Broadcasting Network as the Chief Financial Officer of the group. Greg has developed a passion in teaching students, especially in areas relating to potential, leadership, and the process of bringing young visions to reality and fulfillment. Before we started this morning, he was sharing us how hectic he is with the training that he's conducting and teaching people how to manage finances and so on. So that's the work that he is doing. He also teaches extensively on business principles and the effective stewardship of Christian ministry. Is married to, I hope I'll pronounce it correctly, Greg, please pardon me, Juanita, and has two married children as well. Greg, without further ado, let me hand over to you to give us what is in your heart, and we're looking forward to receive. Over to you, Greg. Good morning.
Thank you, Sipho. Good morning, everybody. It's my privilege to be with you. And just to the ACM for the work that you're doing, it's goes very noticed, I can assure you. And I think that these opportunities are a goldmine. They really are. Let me just say this before I start, that I've been around long enough to know that you never know everything, that's for sure. And I also think that especially when we start speaking in financial terms, you know, there's a lot to be learnt from what I call street traders, because when you are streetwise, you tend to survive. And I really, you know, it's easy for us to approach this whole subject very academically, but I think that we need to try and approach it in the most practical way possible. So what I've tried to do is to put a presentation together that's really just based on what I've learned in practice. This is not theory. This is just stuff that we've tried to apply in practice. Sometimes we've made lots of mistakes, and other times we've got some things right. I've asked Natalie to help me drive the presentation. But let me just start by saying this. You know, it's one thing to try and do a talk on financial strategies, but we must understand that the finances of our ministries is completely linked to our operating strategies, okay? You can't separate the two. So don't ever look at the financial life of your ministry as a subject on its own. There is definitely a symbiotic relationship between, you know, your finances and then your organizational and your operational strategies in a ministry. So if you've got good organizational and operational strategies, in other words, you just run the ministry well, then your finances are going to respond positively. But at the same time, when you run the finances well, you're going to adequately provide and support the operational strategies. So I think it's very important to paint that context. It really is. And also, you know, for people starting out in ministry or business, or people that have been in ministry and business for a long time, there's obviously a difference, because when you start out, you're going to have to be gradual about certain things. But if you've been in business or ministry for a long time, then a lot of your strategies are in place, you know. So you apply these principles to varying degrees. But I do want to say this, that you have to apply them all. I do believe that that's very important. And the last comment by way of introduction, you know, often in speaking to pastors, is speaking to folk that are in ministry, sometimes they, you know, they call us non-prophets. But I want to say to everybody and suggest to you, you know, if you're in ministry because of souls first, whether you're in radio, television, church, it doesn't matter. Souls is the fruit that we're really after. But you have to make a profit, because if you don't make a profit, you're not going to be around for long. And for some people, they don't like the word profit. I always say to them, well, if that offends your sensibilities, then please just change it to the word surplus and we'll be good to go. It's just very important that whatever we do in our ministry.
Sorry, is it just me who have lost Greg? Oh, okay.
We have lost him.
We have lost him. He looks frozen.
No, it's fine. He earlier did mention that there might be a load shedding switch on his side, I hope. But he said if that happens, he will be able to join again. Let's please give him a few minutes or a second while he's trying to log in back again. I see we've also been joined by other people who just, Nkolisi, welcome. I see you've just joined us. You came in when we've just started and after we've introduced ourselves. But maybe as we are waiting for Greg, let me allow you the opportunity also to just introduce yourself to us so that we know who you are and which organization you're coming from. Nkolisi, can you hear us? Hello? Okay. All right. Nolwandle was also battling with connectivity. I see. I assume is a she. She's back. Nolwandle, you there? You now can hear? All right. But everybody can hear me. I see it looks like people can hear me. Can you all hear me? Please nod if you can hear me. All right. The problem is not on my side. All right, great. Oh, here's Greg. He's back. Thank you very much. Greg, welcome back. Not a problem. Please unmute if you can there. Greg?
Thank you. I'm not sure what happened there, why it dropped me.
Okay, but not a problem at all. You can continue. Over to you.
Okay. Natalie, if you could, are you able to put the slides up?
Yes, I will do that.
There we go. Okay, so let's get to the first one. That one. Thank you. And the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so the first comment is that we must understand that in our ministries, and I think based on the people that I can see online, I'm going to focus mainly on ministry itself. You know, there are certain things in our ministries that are controllable and that we can take care of, and things that are uncontrollable. Both are going to have an effect on our future success. Even some of the so-called uncontrollable influences, we can exercise some influence relating to them. And if we go to the next slide, what I've done is just listed a couple of examples for you. Now, going down the left-hand side, the kind of things that you can control, firstly, would be your understanding of the industry that you're operating in and the environment that you're operating in. Now, look, I've been in television and radio for 20 years, and I can tell you that there are technological and regulatory changes that happen that I battle to keep pace with. But it is an area that I believe if any of us are going to be successful, particularly from a financial point of view, we need to spend a lot of time in this area obtaining a proper, thorough understanding of our industry. And the next one would obviously be our business and organizational leadership, you know, the structure of the ministry and how it functions, because those two things have a significant impact on our finances. If we don't get that right, we're not going to have a lot of finances to manage. So those are things that we can definitely control. I'm going to talk a little bit about that coming up now. Our knowledge and understanding, you know, and our competency and our skills. My experience has been often, particularly in ministry, sometimes particularly
we lost him again. Okay, I wasn't sure whether it's me or it's on his side.
It's same here as well.
Okay, apologies. He might have to check the network on his side. And perhaps, I don't know if the bandwidth is a contributor on this, that maybe we may need all to switch off our videos so that we try and save the bandwidth when he comes back. I would request that we give him few minutes again and see how best this happens. And please, as he continues, you are more than welcome to type in your questions or comments on the chat box, and I'll make sure that I pose those questions to him when he is done. Sorry, Natalie, can you, while we're waiting for, I can't see with the presentation on. Is the presentation on? Yeah. Yeah. So that I see if he's back. Sorry, my screen is, oh, here he is, he's back. Okay. Greg, you can hear us, I assume. Okay, you need to unmute that side.
Okay, I'm back and I'm clear. I apologize, I don't know what the problem is.
Yeah, what we will do, we'll all switch off, except you, we'll all switch off our videos so that we try and save some bandwidth and see how it goes. These things do happen, no much stress. Just continue where you've left. Thank you very much, Greg.
Okay, thank you, Sipho. Okay, so then the next point, just a general point, something that we are able to control is our financial stewardship, you know, the recording of from an accounting perspective and how we report, basically. That is a very important aspect. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well. But those are things that we can control. Also, our own financial disciplines. Now, being a married man, that's something at home we've got to get right, but that same skill has to translate into our ministries. Being able to manage our revenue sources, being able to manage our cost exposure, and being able to control that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and just some methods around that. And then a very important aspect that I often see not done adequately, and that is obtaining competent professional advice. And here I'm talking about legal advice, and I'm talking about accounting advice and tax advice, even in nonprofits. This is a very important aspect. So often I see advice being delivered from people that, quite frankly, shouldn't be giving the advice, and it eventually harms the ministry, and that's a great concern for me. When we look at things that you can't control, well, obviously you can't control things that are on a national basis: economic growth, inflation, unemployment, currency fluctuations. Tax policy is always a problem, and it's very difficult for us to have much control about that. Obviously, as we all experienced this last year and continuing into this year, pandemics, health pandemics, political change, these things are disruptors, and we have to be able to respond to them, but it's difficult to exercise that much. When it comes to legislation, it's a similar issue. However, my experience, particularly dealing with television and radio, is it has been possible to exercise quite significant influence over some of the regulatory environment. And I think for our radio and television viewers on this seminar, you will understand that, because I think that's something that you must never let go of. You do have a significant representation, particularly through organizations like the ACM and the NAB. Crisis events in your organization, climatic events, etc. So we've got stuff that we can control, we've got stuff that we can't control. I want to focus today on what we can control, the basics of that. And Natalie, if you can go to the next slide, this summarizes what I want to deal with. Now, it looks like a lot, and it is a lot. Some of it I'm going to do extremely quickly. Others I'm going to dig into a little bit. Now, if we have a look at this, you know, all of these things need to be addressed because they actually operate collectively for your ministry. You don't look at them necessarily just individually. All of them apply. So we're going to talk about a spiritual foundation. We're going to talk about vision and business strategy, entity structure, which is crucial, revenue management, which is very, very important. Obviously, cash management and budgeting. We'll have a little bit of a look at debt management, tax management. Even in nonprofits, you will see why that could be a crisis in your ministry. We will look at strategic giving, and we've already spoken about competent and professional advisors. So Natalie, if we could go to the next one, which just deals with the spiritual foundation. We all know Matthew 6:33 talks about seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And therefore we must resolve to minister the kingdom of God in everything that we do. And there I'm including, you know, our operating ethos, how we treat people, etc. There must be an adherence to biblical morality first, and then legislative morality. It's particularly when it affects things like our regulatory requirements, tax and things like that. But I just want to say at the outset on this, you know, so many times people ask me, Greg, what is a kingdom business? And I always say to them, well, I've never known what a kingdom business is. I don't think it exists. What does exist is a business or a ministry that has a kingdom focus and orientation, because it's run on principles based on the word and leadership principles based on the word. So I think it's just important to get it right. But the real point that I wanted to make here is, before we even talk about administering your finances, our vision for our ministry and the strategies that we use must be birthed in prayer. Because, you know, Proverbs talks about the Lord giving us godly and skillful wisdom, and it also talks about being adept at wise dealing. All of those originate in our prayer rooms. And we do look at Proverbs, you know, chapter 16, verse 3, which talks about rolling your works upon the Lord, you know, and he will order your steps and your plans will be established. So I think it's just very important to start out. It's very easy to descend into what is essentially a secular business or ministry discussion, but we must understand our focus always is on, you know, the precepts of the Bible first, and that is really what our focus is. Now, if we go to the next slide, where we're talking about vision and business strategy, this is quite important, because I think that we need to understand clearly what we're aiming at in our ministries, or else we're never going to reach it. And what I'm going to say is going to become clear now. You know, so many times what I've encountered is where there's a vague vision, and it's an organizational killer. It really is. We'll never be 100% clear about what our final picture is going to look like, but we must have a very good idea so that we know what we're aiming at. Because there's a difference, folk, between being busy in our ministries and rather than being intentionally focused and effective and building towards something. You know, our strategies have to be directional. We need to be aiming at a specific outcome that we're looking for. It's no good for us just to be in our ministries trying to survive every day. We must be actively building towards something. And I just want to introduce this thought, because what I've also encountered in ministry, which is a real organization killer and affects your financial life, is that in all of Scripture, I've never seen leadership being delegated to a committee by the Lord. It's always delegated to an individual who collects a team. Now, we all know that as so-called non-profit organizations, we have to have a board. But I want to really encourage you to make sure that you have a pilot who manages the board as well. I describe it this way when I'm teaching on this. You know, the Holy Spirit is the navigator, but we have to be in the driver's seat. And a committee is not going to run something very well. It needs to have somebody who's exercising significant influence over that committee in order to drive the vision. And, you know, in brackets next to that, you can, you know, that's kind of ICASA versus reality, because we know certainly in television and with radio that ICASA require us to have a board, and it is indeed very good governance. But we need to be careful how we handle that in our ministries. The next point is that we must set priorities in the organization. Now, you can have 2, you can have 5. If you're going to have much more than that, I think it's going to be difficult to reach. But our strategies and our decisions are aimed at achieving those 5 priorities. Really what we want to do is to put our people onto those priorities. That's the main thing. That's the difference between being busy or being effective. Now, I just wanted to use an example just relating to some strategy. And this is just something that of my experience at Link FM. I've been involved with Link FM now for nearly 20 years. And it's been an interesting experience because I've come to realize that we needed to make certain practical things happen in order to get our finances right. So one of the first things we did at Link is we made as extensive use of volunteers as we could. So for example, the presenters on the station, other than the presenters that work during a work day, are in fact not paid. They are volunteers. We do pay a travel stipend, but it's a limited amount of money. And the whole idea is in order to limit the human resource cost, which is, you would agree, is a fixed cost. It's going to be the same amount every month. So to the extent that you can limit that cost, you're going to be able to enhance your ability to survive as a ministry. What we found as a result of employing this strategy is that the presenters that came onto the station were coming onto the station for the sake of the ministry instead of financial reward. Now, what that did it had two effects. The one effect it had was to save us an enormous amount of money, but the other effect that it had was to enhance the quality of what was happening on radio, because they were seeing it as a ministry instead of as a job. And we found that to be a tremendous thing in terms of also enhancing the brand value of the station as well. The other thing we did based on our license conditions is to manage the language mix and the programming mix. So what well, first of all, the percentage talk and music is what we managed. So what we did as a ministry is to try and have much more emphasis on music than talk. Why that helped us with our financial strategy is a number of areas. The first thing is it increased the quality of what was happening on radio, because we could control the music content better than we could control the speaking content. The second thing it did is it narrowed the lanes theologically in our ministry so that we didn't have any weird stuff happening on radio. It kept it the lanes pretty narrow. And as a result of that, the brand value of the station went up, and the listening experience obviously went up, because we saw translated into advertisers now wanting to participate in the station. So that was quite an important thing. And then further to that, what we did is we realized that between 6 a.m. in the morning and 6 p.m. at night is probably going to be our greatest opportunity for advertising revenue over and above the donation income stream. And so we made sure that we began to regulate quite carefully and plan and arrange what the programming mix would be in that 12-hour period in order to maximize the revenue potential. So those were just very quickly, very high level and very briefly, with just some strategies we put into place. Those are operational strategies, but they translated into a successful financial result. And I just wanted to share that. If we go to the next slide, I need to address this point, because this is also one where I have found there to be problems in practice. Now, most of you online at the moment are probably operating as public benefit organizations, or you should be. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to deal with this point, because you can, in order for you to be legal in your ministry, you have to be operating as a public benefit organization. And the only 4 ways that you can possibly operate is either as a non-profit company in terms of the Companies Act, a non-profit trust in terms of the Trust Properties Control Act, or you could be a voluntary association of members, but you've got a constitution, or you could be a local branch of a foreign tax exempt entity. Now, those are the only 4 ways that you can operate a ministry and take donations from the general public. Because for-profit entities would be operating as a private company, an inter vivos trust, you could be a partnership, you could be a sole proprietor, there could be some other forms, but essentially those last 4 are very different to the top 4. And what I've found is that in ministry, there are often ministries that are operating, but not as public benefit organizations. Let me explain this. In 2001, when the Income Tax Act was changed in order to try and regulate so-called non-profit entities, they created this animal called a public benefit organization, and you have to register that specifically with SARS. Now, it will be one of those top 4 entities. You've got to register it with SARS, but at the same time, they made it mandatory that you had to register with the Department of Non-Profit Organizations, and you had to get an NPO number. That has subsequently been removed from the Income Tax Act. It is now something that is more voluntary than mandatory. So if you are operating with an NPO number and not a PBO number, you are technically operating illegally. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to explain this to you. The other thing that affects you financially is that you must remember that if you're operating as a public benefit organization, all the resources, assets, income, and everything of the entity have to be applied towards the common object. It cannot be distributed to anybody other than in the form of a fair remuneration. Put simply, nobody owns a ministry. And it's very crucial to your financial management to make sure that that is understood and it's sacrosanct. Now, if we move on to revenue management itself, this is quite an interesting area. Natalie, if you can go to that slide, just the next one, revenue management. Now, it's one thing for us to consider controlling costs and all sorts of things in the ministry, and often as accountants, we go there first. But I think a very, very crucial area here in your ministry or your business is to identify what revenue sources, you know, your organization needs to have. Now, obviously, in a ministry, you're going to be having donations of various forms. In a church, it would be tithes and offerings. In a radio station, it would be donations. In television, it would probably be donations as well. But there could be other forms and other revenue sources you could use. So, for example, advertising. In the case of a radio station or a television station could work very, very nicely to you. You could have things like grant funding, which I'll talk about just now. But the most fundamental thing that you have to do at the outset is to identify what the revenue sources are that you're going to go after. And sometimes when I'm teaching students, they say to me, but Greg, you make this sound all about money. No, it's about souls. But unless you have revenue into your ministry, obviously we're not going to be harvesting souls here. So this is an extremely basic but very fundamental area that you have to try and develop. And you've got to develop these revenue streams as best as possible. Now, what I have found to be a rather good way to do this is to identify what you could call your stable or regular or assured sources of revenue, okay? Because that will establish a reliable income stream that's going to come in, and spend most of your time managing those. If you like, you can call it your bread and butter income. You must be able to do that, because what I've experienced with ministry is that when we go to your cost structure, you'll probably agree with me that you've experienced your cost structure is pretty certain and it's pretty fixed every month. And therefore, you need to meet that demand with a stable form of revenue. So you must look at it. At the same time, you would definitely want to investigate alternative sources of revenue, you know, to complement it. So, but before I get to that, you see, it's very critical in your ministry that what you do is you establish what is your break-even revenue that you need. So if your costs, for example, a month are 150,000 Rand, or that'll work, 150,000 Rand a month, well, then you know that you're going to need revenue of 150,000 Rand a month. So if you divide revenue by the amount of effective trading days that you have in a month, you will know how much you've got to make every day. And that's very important. One of the critical indicators I've used at Link FM over the last 20 years is to understand how much does it cost me to run the radio station every single day. Because that gives me an idea of the donations that I need, and it also gives me an idea of the daily advertising revenue that I need to keep the station on air. So this break-even analysis is not really a complicated thing, especially if your monthly costs are pretty certain, if they're not that variable. Now, in some radio stations, for example, we pay commissions to somebody who might be raising donations or might be raising advertising. Well, that does create a bit of a variable cost that we've got to contemplate. But outside of that, our monthly costs are pretty fixed and certain, and therefore we would understand what our monthly revenue needs to be. Now, when we establish stable sources of revenue, this is really what I'm referring to. You want those to be at least your break-even level, so that when you go and obtain other sources of funding, that is the cherry on the top. That would be the ideal in terms of your approach and strategy. It would take you a while to achieve that position. The other thing which can be very handy, particularly in television and radio, is to have contracted sources of revenue. So if you're selling advertising, don't sell it on a month-to-month basis, sell it on a period basis, which might incorporate a few months. You know, you could do a 6-month deal with an advertiser, and it gives you some assurance as to stability of your revenue source. To me, that's quite a nice thing to have. Also, when you look at your turnover, and this is what I would call, like in the Second World War, they used to drop a depth charge to sink a submarine. One of the depth charges in your financial life could be value-added tax. Because if your particular ministry is registered for value-added tax, and I don't have time to go into the technicalities of that, but if it is registered for value-added tax, please make sure that in terms of measuring your revenue, you always exclude the VAT portion, because that's really just a liability to SARS, so that you're not trying to pay your bills with SARS's money. That's basically what I'm saying. It's quite an important one, and I hope that's clear. Obviously, and the next point, we want to investigate alternative sources of revenue to complement our regular sources. I want to sound a word of warning here, because, you know, I just raised the issue of Section 18A certificates, because some people try to incentivize getting donations into their ministries by being able to issue Section 18A certificates. What a Section 18A certificate does is it gives the donor the ability to deduct the donation for tax purposes. So it's obviously an incentive for people to give you some money. The problem is that you have to be doing a certain type of activity. It's a ring-fenced activity, particularly, for example, in the welfare arena, looking after the poor and things like that. But then that donation has to be applied for that purpose. It can't be applied for another purpose. So what we see is some ministries trying to use the Section 18A certificate and tax deduction opportunity for donors to try and get more money into their ministries. It's fine, provided you are using the funds for the correct application in terms of the Income Tax Act, and it's regulated, that activity, and you have SARS's permission to issue the Section 18A certificates. Typically, for example, where a church is in receipt of tithes and offerings, there is no ways in the Income Tax Act that you may legally issue a Section 18A certificate. So you would be involving yourself in something which is wholly irregular. So one must just be a bit careful about that. And then two last very important points on the management of the income or revenue side of your ministry is this. Here's the question: does all of the money actually come in? How secure are your systems? In the case of a church where you're taking offerings, how do you know that all of the offerings actually get to the bank account? You must have a system that looks after that. If you in a radio station or television station or some other ministry of a similar nature, how do you know that all your donations actually do come in and are not being diverted somewhere else fraudulently, as terrible as it is to contemplate that? And also, if you are billing for advertising, for example, who's taking care of actually collecting the advertising? Who's making sure that they actually do pay? It sounds very basic, but I've often seen that not being looked after, and the ministry has got financial trouble, and it's a basic revenue management issue, which is just really not being looked after. Nats, if we could go to the next page, some non-profits try and get grant funding. I think it's a great thing. For example, if you need to establish yourself, there's the opportunity of using places like the MDDA. But I always indicate to people, remember, there's often not a thing called a free lunch. Sometimes there are some requirements related to that grant funding. Just read your documents very carefully. And then at the end of the day, what we want to do in our ministries is to achieve a return on investment, or growth rate, if you like. we're not really a conventional business. So the way we look at it is slightly different. But at the end of the day, we want our revenue to grow year on year. Now, how much do you want it to grow by? Well, it's really, I guess, inflation, the cost of capital. You know, if you had to borrow money, what would that interest rate be? You want your income, your revenue, to grow at least that level. In fact, after paying costs, you want your profit or your surplus to grow at least that percentage. And the reason is because next year, it's going to cost you that much more to be in ministry, simply by inflation alone. And therefore, we want our income to keep pace with that. To the extent that your income doesn't, you're actually diminishing your financial resources, not increasing them. And the last point on revenue management is this. I've discovered that a significant influencer on your revenue is going to be your unique brand promise. Every ministry has a different brand promise. And I don't think it's distasteful to talk about this, because if we talk about television or we talk about radio, and radio specifically, every radio station has a different brand experience. You know, by being a listener to that station, what is the promise you get? What is your listener experience by being connected to that particular ministry? Now, obviously, it's the same word of God, but we all deliver it differently. And that's why we've got different listeners. We've got different television viewers. You've got different people coming to your church. You know, what is the ethos of your church? What is the brand promise? And whatever that is, I have found to have a critical relationship to revenue management. So I would suggest that that's just an area that we want to keep pace on and never, ever forget. Now, moving to cash management and budgeting, which is the next slide. Obviously, the basic thing you do is you set a budget and then you implement a cash flow management policy. Well, the budget is straightforward, because what you're going to now do is you're going to now try and set out on a monthly basis by category of expense, what are you going to be spending? Because it is a spending budget. It's not something that you're reluctant about. If you're going to be operating as a ministry, you've got to spend money. So all you're doing here is you're setting out as realistically as possible what that is going to be. You must also not forget that certain expenses fluctuate every month. So it's, you know, I'll give you an example. You may pay bonuses, for example. Well, do you pay those in the birthday month? Do you pay those once a year in December? Or do you not pay bonuses? Whatever the answers to those questions are is going to determine what that budget needs to be for that particular month, for that category called the human resource cost, if you like. So setting a budget, which is really a spending plan, is your first and most important basic step. It's also going to help you determine what your fixed monthly costs are and what your variable costs are. So, for example, if you're paying a commission to somebody, well, that would be a variable cost based on what the income is. Okay, so, and I think very important just to mention here that in the actual cost budget that you're going to set out here, you must include your strategic financial giving. Now, I'm going to talk about that under a separate heading at the end, but giving from your ministry is critically important. We have found that in our ministries that really our giving has been an incredibly important aspect, and the Lord's covenant promise of harvest is what we have seen regularly. And so I would definitely make sure that this forms part of your budget, but I will deal with that separately in a few moments. When we look at just the management of your cash resources themselves, you know, you want to control the expenditure and you want to control how you spend it. It's one thing for us to control it in terms of saying, well, look, this is the budget, and on advertising expense for our ministry, you know, this is the amount that we're going to spend. But who is responsible for actually doing the payments for your ministry? Because there's a thing in life called incompatible functions that ideally need to be separated. And I would always, wherever possible, try and make sure that the person who's doing your books, is not the same person who does the payments. Because if I'm doing your books and I'm doing your payments, as distasteful as this may sound, I have the opportunity to manipulate what's going on and hide unauthorized disbursements in the accounting process. So it's just something that, as distasteful as it is, I do believe it's something that we need to be very, very careful about. Another area that I've seen massive problems in is the use of so-called company credit cards. And there's no control over how those are used to be spent. I think that speaks for itself. I think everybody online here probably knows how credit cards work and the dangers inherent in them. So really, at the end of the day, there needs to be a very rigid policy and a system to control approval of payments and then how those funds are get dispersed. I believe that to be a really critical element. If you are online and you're in an organization where you do have owners, then one of the other things you're going to have to deal with is where owners now want a return on their investment. You can call it a dividend, you can call it a return of capital, whatever you want to call it. Basically, your owners are after the cash that you're making, and that is going to be a problem. Obviously, that is not a problem when we are in ministry, because all the funds can only be used for directly related ministry expenses. If we go to the next page, I just want to share something that I have found in our ministries to be incredibly useful. And what that is to implement a weekly savings strategy. Let me start explaining that by saying this. You know, when I'm ministering to a married couple or a young person starting out, I will always say to them, the first two things you need to do when you get your very first salary check, the first thing is you tithe 10%. But the second thing you do is you save 10%. And then you live out of 80%. If you do that from your very first paycheck, you're going to end up being a very wealthy person. What we've tried to do in our ministries is to do exactly the same thing. So every Monday, every single Monday, what we do is we work out how much money came in, we take 10% of it, and we put it into a savings account. And that is our savings fund. The idea is for that savings fund always to have at least 3 months expenses in it. That's kind of our air raid fund, so that if we do get into a bit of crisis, we've got some boodle in the bank. But the other reason for that is in order for us to stay out of debt. So that if we need to buy some equipment or we need to replace certain things, we can do it cash and we don't have to keep running to the bank. Because my experience with banks consistently over 20 years is that they do not see ministry always as a bankable proposition for two reasons. Often because a ministry doesn't have sufficient assets to back the loan, but mostly because they see you as being bad press. If they have to foreclose on you as a ministry, they don't see that as a good write-up in the newspaper, and therefore they would rather stay away from ministry. And so all of us are really in a position where we need to operate on a cash basis to the greatest extent possible. I just wanted to raise this one as well, dealing with employment costs, because one of the things I think where we can get into trouble from a budgetary point of view is with our permanent staff in our ministries, where we contract with them to pay them a 13th check at the end of the year. That's possibly not a very wise thing to do. It would be better to make bonuses discretionary completely and also based on performance. That way you have discretion in times of tight cash flow not to pay the bonus. Indeed, increases should also be on the same basis. I don't see it as necessarily the most intelligent thing to do to contract for that, because, for example, you could contract for a 10% increase, your income is growing at maybe 1% or 2%, you're eventually going to be out of ministry before you know it. The other thing I've found to be a useful mechanism in the case of paying collections is to never, not collections, to pay commissions. So, for example, in a radio station where you have somebody who sells advertising and a major source of your revenue coming into the radio station is commission, never pay commissions based on the sale. Pay commission based on the money when it's banked. That way, you're not effectively a bank yourself, because you're going to end up paying commissions to a sales agent and you still scrambling to collect the sale. So one of the things I have always implemented personally here is that we only ever pay commissions, obviously based on a target, but it's a target banked. It's not a target sold. And always exclude the VAT element if you're registered for VAT, because the VAT isn't income to you, it's tax to go to source. We spoke about using volunteers. And then just a last point on cash management and budgeting is that you must have some kind of foresight and plan relating to your capital expenditure. You know, you're going to have to replace equipment. You're going to have to replace furniture in your church. You're going to have to replace these various things. What is the timing of that? What is the likely amount of that? And your saving strategy that we're talking about is going to assist you to be able to finance that. And then I just want to move on to the next one, if I can, Natalie, which is just dealing with tax management. And I felt that this would be quite important, because even though most of us on this call are in ministry.
Before you move on to the next one, apologies to disturb you.
No problem.
We only have, can I just borrow you 5 minutes, if possible, to wrap up?
That is what I intend, Sipho, and that's exactly where I'm going.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So relating to this, even though we are in ministry, we do actually have a tax exposure. It may not be income tax, I'll come to that now, but definitely you're going to employ people. So you're going to have to pay PAYE, you might have to pay UIF for them. You may have to pay income tax if you've got income other than just things like donations. So typically in a television broadcaster or a radio station where you've got revenue from the form of trading, like advertising, you may have to pay income tax on that element of your revenue. Now, there are methods in the Income Tax Act to be able to do that, but you may need to do it, and that's why you need competent professional advice. But the reason why I raise these points is because, particularly when it comes to things like PAYE, you've got timelines in the Income Tax Act by when you've got to pay these things. If we don't pay them on time, there are penalties, which is just a needless waste of money. So it's very important just to know about that. And the other real reason why I wanted this page is just to highlight to you that, if you are registered for VAT in your ministries, please remember that not all of your VAT is necessarily deductible. You're only going to be able to deduct a portion of your VAT based on the income on which VAT applies, which would typically be, for example, be with advertising. So just an important point to mention. Going on to the next slide, dealing with giving and sowing of seed. It's very important to implement a policy of strategic financial giving in your ministry, because we must harness the covenant promises of the Lord. When we do this, it's been my consistent experience. I've seen the Lord come through with breathtaking harvest that you never, ever expected. But one of the bits of advice I want to give is always look for fertile spiritual soil in which to sow. And what I mean by that? Well, sow into ministries that are harvesting souls for the kingdom. To me, that is fertile soil as far as your strategic financial giving is. It's not just giving for the sake of giving. It's very, very deliberate. One of the techniques we've always used is to sow up and to give out. So from our ministries, we give out into other ministries. We give out into the works that they do, especially feeding the poor, things like that. But we do also do what we call sowing up, sowing into ministries that are harvesting souls, but also ministries that have a blessing on them that we need for our own ministry. If you are in business, just bear in mind that often when you give donations, they come out after tax. So just bear that in mind. They're not always tax deductible unless you're giving into another ministry where you can get a Section 18A certificate, but those are not always available. And then just lastly, on the next slide, dealing with debt management. Now, debt is something that we want to avoid as much as possible, but there are times where we have to have some element of borrowing in our ministries. It's not something that's particularly invited, but if you do, make sure that you're financing tangible assets as opposed to really the cost of running your ministries, because otherwise there are no assets to back that. And to the extent that you've got debt in your ministries, be aware that if it's not repaid, you are obviously at tremendous risk. I would urge everybody to implement the most stringent cash flow and cash management possible, as well as that whole savings policy to try and eliminate the incidence of debt. It's a critical thing. It really is. With that said, I am basically done, and I would look forward to any questions that I could try to answer. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Greg, for that wonderful presentation. Very enlightening as well for us to understand how we run our businesses, particularly when it comes to the finances. I was quite interested when you spoke about some of the internal controls that we need to put in place in running our institution, you know, ranging from the accounting processes that you need as an institution, and also the authorization and approval that you need as an institution. Many times we find the person who authorizes and approves is the same person. And also the segregation of duties, as you've mentioned it, that we need to be careful not to have our bookkeeper the one who's also doing the payments. Otherwise, that on its own, it's a problem. And it is very important that we have that strong supervision and also that training within our organization. I have one question to ask, but maybe before I throw my question, I would open the floor to our attendees to ask the questions that you have. Please feel free to ask any question that you may want. Particularly, it might be pertaining what Greg has spoke about or anything within the framework of finances. Maybe Greg did not touch about it, and we can see how best that we give the response. I would request that you show your hands on your screen. There's a reaction button there where you can raise up your hand, particularly those who've got their cameras off, because I can't see you. If you have your camera on, at least I can see you by raising your hand. Neo Potwana, is that a clap of hand or raising hand to ask a question? If there's a raise of hand to ask a question, I'll give you that opportunity. If not,
it's a question.
Great. Greetings, Neo, and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Greg. I was just wanting to maybe go back to the point he made about, which I feel is very valid, the quality of what's on air. He said with Link FM, they increased music, they played more music and less talk, which has worked for them. I'm just wondering if perhaps the same would be expected to have the same results if you did the direct opposite for a station that's a talk radio station, whereby you increase your talk or the quality of your talk, which will positively have an effect on your revenue. I'm asking because I know with most people are impatient these days, they don't want to listen. I think that's why we have the gospel as well. People don't want to listen to anything. So are we going to move towards music stations because of that? Or perhaps we're going to use the gospel to sort of change or bring the winds of change? So maybe just his advice on considering increasing the quality of talk there is for stations out there. Would it work as positively same as how he said that they were playing more music?
Yeah. Neo, thanks for that question. I think it's a brilliant question. And just to clarify that, no, I was referring to us as in terms of our own unique circumstances. if your license is really focused on talk radio, and that is what you've heard from the Lord, and that is really the emphasis that you want to bring with your particular ministry, then that is what you got to do. But I do believe that it is very important to take into account that you're going to have a lot of listeners with a lot of slightly different theological persuasions, for example. And in order to retain your listener base, I do believe that one of your operational strategies would be to look after what and how, the word of God is shared in your talk radio elements. One of the things we've experienced, for example, sometimes is, and we've had to deal with it with some internal training, is where some presenters come onto the radio and sometimes the theology is a little bit questionable. So it's just something that we've got to take care of, and just be a little bit care of that, because at the end of the day, you're wanting to make sure that you look after your donor base as well. So when we just found in our particular circumstances, it was a little bit easier to control because of our music language mix. Okay, we do have quite a lot of talk radio happening as well. So my point was not to suggest that our method is the right method. I was just using that as an illustration, as an example. If your license conditions are focused towards talk radio, you're just going to handle it slightly different. But the same principle would apply, because you want to protect the value of what's being shared on air in terms of the brand value and obviously the purity of the Word of God.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks, Neil, for that question. Indeed, Greg, I've seen many of the radio stations at the end of the day compromising the quality of the Word of God with the revenue that they get. Yeah. And sometimes it's very important to strike that balance instead of just focusing on the revenue. Adele, I see your hand is raised. Over to you. You can pose your question, please.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Greg. That was a really inspiring talk, and helps us to just make sure we're on the right page when setting up our business strategies for how we run things. So thank you. My question is just to ask around volunteers. Yeah. Obviously, as community radio stations, we do work with a lot of volunteers and have for many years. Obviously, for us to use volunteers on air is the best option, but it's not always for quality in terms of to try and get the best sound on air. That doesn't work always very well. Now, I just wanted to find out, you said, you pay them a little bit towards travel. How long, or, like somebody could volunteer for a time, but when they've given a lot of their time and effort and put a lot into shows and so forth, do you change that agreement down the line and maybe start paying them a bit more for what they're worth? How does it, and we seem to have done something like that, but it's gotten perhaps a little out of hand in terms of what we pay certain volunteers. Every year you tend to seem to want to just increase it a little bit. How do you manage that in terms of making sure that that doesn't become eventually too much? Maybe started out as a small travel allowance, but they've been perhaps with you for 7-8 years or more, and now they're getting quite a bit. So yeah, I just wanted to get your overview. Obviously, it's your core business, as that is who really is driving your radio station forward, bringing your listeners to listen. They do a lot of preparation. There's a lot of training that they go through. We expect a lot from our presenters as volunteers. But where do you draw the line in terms of how much you pay them? Or must it just always be a volunteer thing? Or does it come to some point eventually where you can give them a bit more?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Adele. Thanks for that question. I think there are two aspects to it. The first one relates to quality that you asked. Now, I think that a lot of that, and first of all, please understand from our perspective, I don't pretend ever to think that we've got it all right. Please let me be very transparent on that issue. That would be hugely wrong. But I think that a lot of that has to do with the ethos and brand of your particular ministry, so that the people that are knocking on your door to come and serve in the ministry already understand the level at which they need to operate. Now, sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't quite get that right. And yes, there's always training and there's always those things in development of people that you've got to do. But I think at the outset, you need to create in your ministry, there needs to be created an understanding of the excellence with which you intend to operate. I think it's very, very important. And frankly, you know, for us in churches, we expect that of our volunteers in churches, that the same level of excellence should really be there, whether you're paid or not. In fact, may I be bold enough to suggest that when you're a volunteer, you're volunteering because you are volunteering. And therefore, you are volunteering to serve at the highest level of excellence you can personally deliver. And I think when that is understood as the expectation, it begins to translate into behavioral change. And we start seeing people coming to volunteer as presenters on your station, because this for them is ministry. This is not about anything other than ministry. And they take their ministry to the Lord that seriously. And what we have found in the majority of cases, we've had some superb failures, but in the majority of cases, what we have found is that people come through our doors with that mentality intact, and therefore they continually deliver. And I mean, when I listen to some of it, it's quite extraordinary what they deliver, because they understand that that's the ethos of the ministry. As far as the payment is concerned, we personally have drawn a distinction between the daytime presenters and the evening presenters. So we broadcast typically from, 24 hours a day, but really we've got presenters in the studio from, I think, 5 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock at night. But between 6 and 6 at night, that, if you're presenting on radio during those times, you're now incapable of having another job, which means that we do differentiate between those two time zones, okay? Because it would be unfair. So obviously those people in that 12-hour period are going to be dealt with financially differently, Adele. But in the evenings, whether from Monday to Sunday, and obviously Saturdays and Sundays would be the whole day, would be a different thing. That's very much a volunteer basis. We do pay a travel stipend, and that would be inflationary adjusted, but we do not offer anything other than that. So that the expectation remains, this is about ministry. That's what this is. This is not a job. This is about ministry. And, I would say that on balance in the last 20 years, we have found that to be successful in terms of the on-air experience. As I say, we've had some failures that we've had to fix, but by and large, that's the approach we've taken. So we've not opened that doorway. To answer your second question financially, we've been pretty firm on that. It's very difficult to close the door when the horse is bolted.
You set that standard from before you even start with the process. Correct. With somebody.
Correct.
They know this is the yeah. Okay.
Yeah. They know. And what we have found is that the people that come on, and that's where I have tremendous respect, because for those people that come on every single show that they do, this is about their ministry to the Lord, and it really, I think, does contribute very strongly to the overall value of the station because of that mentality,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful advice on the volunteers there. Thanks a lot. Bongi, I see you also raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Greg. A very eye-opening presentation, and I look forward to listening to it again. My question would go back to the section where you spoke about the bread and butter finances, or bread and butter income.
Yeah.
And how important it is to actually maintain that, to nurture that, and make sure, at least try and, as far as possible, to break even. I'm I'm not sure whether my question will be pertinent to this discussion, but we are a church, and most of our income and what you would term the bread and butter income comes from giving.
Yeah.
And because of COVID and the impact of COVID-19, that has dropped drastically.
Yeah.
It's not within our power to maintain. And so my question would be, do you have any suggestions of new financing streams that churches could try and investigate, or ministries could, look into, so as to break even and get that bread and butter income in place?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bongi, for that question. Very valid, very contemporary question that, and it definitely has application. I think, let me start off by saying what we did before I get to a suggestion, maybe what you can do. What we've tried to do in our ministry is to encourage people to give electronically always, to the greatest extent possible. Most people have cell phones. And although data still, until we've got nice cheap broadband, data is expensive. But we still find a lot of people that are still handling their finances on their cell phones, and they're doing their banking on their banking app on their cell phone. And so we as a ministry have tried to participate in that mentality by having people give online to the greatest extent possible. Because obviously under COVID, the first casualty may not be your tithes, which are given online, but it's certainly going to be your offerings, which are given every Sunday. In fact, for the first time in my entire life, I found in ministry we're short of cash. It's in the bank, but we haven't got cash because nobody's giving cash. And so it's quite a unique, interesting problem. And I think many ministries have possibly experienced a similar thing. So I would most definitely encourage your people to give online. It's also a much more secure way for your church to receive income, because it's going to go straight into the correct bank account. There's less administration of that necessary. There are people that will always give cash and will always give, in terms of physical attendance. But obviously under the regulations we all, operating under now, that's going to cause a problem with your income stream. So my advice would be with your congregation is to begin to interact with them digitally. They need to get used to seeing you digitally as well as physically. That can be dangerous because you want them in church. You don't want them on digital platforms only. So they have to manage that incredibly carefully and wisely. But when they're used to talking to you digitally, they will get used to giving digitally. And that would be perhaps the only advice that I could give you, that you need to think about those different platforms other than cash.
Thank you for that. I'm thinking through it as you were talking to me, and I'm thinking about our particular circumstances. We operate in 6 countries, and so we at the head office wouldn't necessarily speak to congregations, and yet the money comes from the congregations to the head office in order to go back to the congregation.
Exactly.
So it's complex.
It's a complex thing. But I do believe that even with denominational type churches, it is an area I think that needs to be investigated, because I'm not really sure what the alternative is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bongi, for that question. Now I see you raised your hand again. Do you want to come in?
Okay, now it's Michelle this time.
Oh.
Let me put my video on.
I remember you said no. It's apologies.
Yeah, it's represented here by a couple of people.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gregory, for your very helpful presentation. We really appreciated it. And thus far here at Good News Community Radio, we've run with volunteers right through, and travel stipends, of course, so that it doesn't cost anyone to work here, but they're working here out of ministering to the Lord.
Yeah.
But we see our need to support staff that work here full-time, you know, like you said, your people that ordinarily would otherwise have a job, because it comes to sustaining staff and not having your core staff rotate because of a need of finances. What I'm wondering, because we're looking into starting to pay our core staff, you know, maybe changing tactic a bit and then having the volunteers, you know, your housewives who want a day out during the week, or people over the weekends or things, volunteers for most of the people, but for a certain core staff to be paid so that we can grow as an organization and not be rebuilding the foundation of people necessarily all the time.
Yeah.
Do you pay your core staff, sorry, a bit of a personal question, do you go into IRP5s and the going rate of what people would charge in the industry normally for that kind of position, or how do you work it? Do you make it still a stipend on the books? No. But it's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's the perfect question. I think that first of all, we do make a distinction. So we do have a permanent staff, but we keep that staff component, the number of people, as low as possible, but we do have a permanent staff. We do pay them salaries. We would do the normal PAYE, UIF, you know, like any payroll in business. So we would treat it absolutely the same. We deduct the tax, we pay it over, we do our RP5 reconciliations once a year with SARS. All of that is done. As to the amount that people get paid, you know, even when I was practicing as an accountant with many of my clients, and I did that for many, many years, how much should I earn? Well, you can earn what the business can afford. That's the bottom line. You must, you know, you want to attract people, but at the same time, you've got to understand that your limitations inherently is your income stream, which means that to put yourself under pressure to pay market-related salaries, which might be too high, is placing yourself in financial hardship. So sometimes the position is not going to be what it would be in terms of a market-related comparison. It is going to be a lower salary. And does that mean that some people might leave you and you'll have some type of rotation? Yes, it does. It absolutely does. And sometimes that is one of the if I can call it the stress costs of ministry, because you have to deal with that. However, if as your ministry builds to a point where especially your stable revenue sources are adequately covering your costs, you're able now to negotiate better, you know, remuneration for people. But don't outbid yourself. Don't put yourself in a situation where you know you're not going to be able to match it, because you're placing yourself into financial hardship. I think when people get involved with ministry, they must understand that it is essentially donor funded. And therefore, it is not correct in my view to take the same aggressive approach as to getting paid what I think I'm worth. I need to get paid what the ministry can afford to pay me. And I know that is maybe a little bit of left field thinking, but I'm inclined to follow that line of thought. It's not poverty thinking, it's just being realistic. So where your ministry can afford to reward people closer to market-related salaries, you must do so. I believe integrity demands that you must do so. But where you can't, the fact is that you can't. And so if I'm going to come on board into your ministry, I must be clear on that issue.
Thanks. And then I just wanted to ask you, your people who go out and aggressively get sales, do they get a core salary and then the commission on top, or do they come in on the basis that they just work on commission?
No, we do also pay a basic salary, and then we pay a commission as well. And we regulate the value of the commission based on certain stratas, financial levels, that targets basically that they've got to hit. So that's the way we do it, because most people do need some kind of basic, you know, basic salary, and we do understand that. So we fit that into the fixed cost structure of the ministry, and obviously the commission is variable based on the income that they bring in. But I must just caution and add that we only pay commissions. This is our policy. We only pay commissions based on money collected.
And just on the side, we're looking at something to do with 18A tax clearance certificate. Can I give you a bell later on today? We're actually working on it tomorrow night with our financial manager and some other people that are helping us. But I thought I'd value your input if I can phone you about that on the side.
Yes, I don't have a problem with that, because that's a very particular area, and there's a lot of malpractice in that area, often just because of ignorance. So I'd be very happy to try and guide you through that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I would think that's the last question for the day. And thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And especially huge thank you to you, Greg, for the lovely presentation and very insightful. And I think we will all go back and process what we've had and see how best we can implement this. Natalie will make the recording available to all of us who attended today. And I think the presentation as well will be made available to all of us. And next week, Thursday, we will be bringing or holding our last session in this training series. I think it will be Peter Rice who will be presenting next week. And the topic will be news content, how to engage your news policy so that your editorial team delivers the latest news in a way that points people to reconciliation in Jesus. That's a mouthful topic. And Peter Rice will be there to deliver that for us. And I would encourage and request you that you sign up for that one and invite others and consider to join us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see others next week, and may God bless you. I'm a pastor as well. I know we didn't open in prayer, but can we just close this session in prayer, just thanking God for what he has done today. We give you the glory, and we thank you this morning for this wonderful session we had with Greg. And Father, we pray that all that he has taught us today, let it sink in us and let us implement it in our respective organizations. And I pray that you strengthen each and every one, Lord, as we strive to serve you as best as we can. Bless Greg, bless the ministry that he's doing and all his endeavors, Lord, in the mighty name of Jesus, we pray. Amen and amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.